My parents separated when I was 18, so a couple of months into my first year of university, and it really came as a bolt from the blue, and I hadn't anticipated it up until that time. I definitely was one of those people that thought I had a perfect family.
When I was about 14, 15, my parents decided to get divorced. And for me, it was very confusing at the time, because clearly as a child who has only never known both their parents being together until that point, suddenly one of them not being there is really tricky.
I think it had been probably brewing for a long time. I can't ever actually remember a time when my parents really got on. They separated actually like the week before lockdown happened. My dad moved out, my mum stayed in the home, and at that time I didn't live at home, my sister didn't live at home, but because of lockdown we then very quickly moved back.
I would say that their relationship started to show strain probably when I was about 9 or 10. Dad was on and off the scene for majority of my childhood, and then they officially sort of separated when I was about 12, 13, so I was very aware of what was happening.
So I grew up in Eastern Europe. My parents have practically separated when my sister was born. We just didn't know about it because they wouldn't tell us. We'd see our dad very rarely, but we just assumed that was because like he was on work trips or whatnot, and like my parents didn't even like sleep in the same bed. Like they always lived in different rooms, but because I didn't realise that wasn't common, I just assumed that that's just, you know, the way the life was.
I remember as a kid, absolutely crippling at the time. I think there's no two ways around that. They got divorced when I was 13, but my dad had a 5-year affair with basically the mum of another kid at my sister's school.
My childhood was a sort of typical childhood of the 70s. My parents separated when I was probably around the age of 6 years old, and I actually didn't understand what was going on.
I kind of had that kind of mental battle in terms of feeling like I needed to pick a side. I've got one sister who's 3 years younger than me. As the divorce progressed, I was living with her to start with, and then I decided to go and live with my dad, and she was living with my mum. That had quite a negative impact on our relationship at the time, because we'd gone from kind of living together for the last, 10, 12 years of our lives to all of a sudden being in a position where we weren't seeing each other particularly often.
They were, I would say, friendly and amicable at the start, and then when things got more and more into like their money and property and like what they were splitting and where it was going, then it became slightly less amicable. Mum would get a letter from Dad's lawyer, and Dad's lawyer would get a letter from Mum's lawyer, and they would say, oh no, I didn't tell them to say that, or I didn't tell them to ask for that, and they would just start kind of squabbling over that, and I think then it just sort of escalated from there, and now they don't speak at all, and they won't even see each other.
And the reality of the situation was that I think both my brother and I were weaponised in the divorce. I didn't really have much contact with my father at the time, so there was kind of one side of the story, and the narrative from my mother was, well, your father doesn't love you because that's why he's left, which of course is a shocking thing to do for a child's logic, especially someone of my age at the time. You think, okay, yeah, my father doesn't love me, that's why he's left. So it was just, an incredibly sort of confusing time.
It impacted me tremendously. It was definitely led by my dad, which was really difficult for me as well, because I previously just worshipped my dad, and we had a really close relationship. We're very similar, and I found it difficult to just view things positively. It made me look back and question everything I had known before. For a long time, I very much rallied against the idea of long-term relationships and marriage and having children myself, because I just assumed it would all fail.
they had mentioned to me that this is what's going to happen. Somebody's going to come to the house and they're going to ask you, who do you want to live with? And I remember being with my mum's side of the family and them saying, you know, you need to pick mum. So it was almost like this expectation that even though I felt very close to my dad, I couldn't pick him because then I was almost betraying the family a little bit.
I think if it's done consensually, as it were, or if it's done nicely, if divorce is done sort of both sides agree that the time is up or that sort of thing, then I think a little bit less taking sides would probably be good. I didn't like that bit very much. It wasn't like emotionally traumatic, but it's just a bit not very fun, is it? Do you know what I mean? There's this constant awkwardness of like, you know, you're with your mum's friends, you can't really talk about dad, or like you can't, you know, bump into each other in the street or whatever, and everyone has to like pretend they don't know each other.
I think there should definitely be a bit less of a stigma around it as well, because like growing up quite Christian in like this Protestant culture, it was just like it was a sin, and if you divorced then you'd failed. It doesn't have to be negative, because my parents didn't really argue as far as I'm concerned. They just, you know, they just fell out of love. So just making it not the wrong choice, but just a choice that you take in your relationship.
You want to protect your children at all costs, I'm sure. But I personally am someone who really values kind of openness and honesty. I think if I was to look at it positively, I know that it's made me a really resilient person, someone who can get through really difficult periods.
And I think that children should be given the benefit of the doubt that they have a voice and they have an opinion, and they understand things more than we give them credit for.
You don't need a license to have children, and yet it's probably one of the most important things any human can do. And actually, you know, divorce can be a positive thing, and it can, you know, you can end up with, you know, two sets of new parents if your parents remarry, and there can be some positives, and that sort of. So I think if it's done well, it can be a sort of power for good. But ultimately, I think if you're going to get divorced, you've got to start with the children. It's the most important thing.